The water hit the dress at 7:23 p.m. By 8:14 a.m. the next morning, the waitress had lost her shifts, her apartment, and her mother's medical coverage. And she still didn't know the pregnant woman she drenched was married to the man systematically erasing her from existence. Eric Weber watched his wife get humiliated by a clumsy waitress in a room full of phones recording every second. And what he did next wasn't revenge. It was surgical, silent, and so methodical that Rebecca Smith thought her life was just falling apart by coincidence until she Googled his name and realized she'd accidentally declared war on Boston's most dangerous billionaire. How do you apologize to someone who's already decided you don't deserve to exist? La Fontaine wasn't just a restaurant. It was a cathedral of wealth, where reservations were booked 6 months out, where platinum credit cards were the minimum entry requirement, and where the chandeliers cost more than most people's homes. Rebecca had been working double shifts there for 3 months, her green uniform pressed to perfection, her smile mechanical but efficient enough to keep the tips flowing. She needed those tips. Her mother's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves. That's when the woman walked in. Heather Sanders moved through the restaurant like liquid grace, a midnight blue maternity gown that shimmered under the crystal chandelier light, custom-made, clearly expensive. Her dark skin glowed against the deep blue satin. She was 7 months pregnant, moving carefully, deliberately, as though every step required thought. But she was alone. No entourage, no reservation escort, no husband trailing behind with that protective hand wealthy men always seemed to place on their wives' backs. Just her, requesting a corner booth in a voice that was educated, refined, and somehow weary. Rebecca watched from across the dining room as Heather settled into table 6. There was something off about the whole scene. The woman's dress screamed money, but her eyes whispered exhaustion. She cradled her pregnant belly with one hand while checking her phone with the other, and Rebecca could have sworn she saw her wipe away a tear when she thought no one was looking. The whispers started almost immediately. Who let her in? Does she even have a reservation? This isn't that kind of place. The words slithered through the restaurant like poison, quiet enough to maintain plausibility, but loud enough to land. Rebecca felt the discomfort crawl up her spine. She'd heard this before, the coded language of exclusion, the performative concern about standards and atmosphere that really meant something uglier. But this was La Fontaine. This was where people with money came to feel superior to other people with slightly less money. Rebecca had learned months ago to keep her head down, take orders, deliver food, collect tips, and go home. Getting involved in customers' drama didn't pay her mother's oxygen bills. Still, something about the woman in the blue dress made Rebecca hesitate. Maybe it was the way Heather's hand instinctively protected her belly when she felt eyes on her. Maybe it was the practiced grace with which she pretended not to hear the whispers. Maybe it was just that Rebecca recognized that particular kind of loneliness, the kind that came from being in a room full of people who acted like you didn't belong. Rebecca approached table 6 with her order pad and her professional smile. "Good evening, ma'am. What can I get for you tonight?" Heather looked up, and for just a second, her carefully constructed composure cracked. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying before she arrived. But she smoothed the expression away quickly, replaced it with that polite distance wealthy people seem to perfect. "The butternut squash soup, please, and water with lemon." "Of course, I'll have that right out." It should have ended there, a simple order, a simple transaction. But as Rebecca turned to leave, a man, 3 tables over, expensive suit, silver hair, the kind of confidence that came from never being told no, made a comment just loud enough to carry. "Hope they're checking IDs at the door now. Can't have just anyone wandering in off the street." Laughter rippled through his table. Rebecca's jaw clenched. Heather's eyes dropped to her menu, but Rebecca saw the way her shoulders tensed, the way her hand tightened protectively around her belly. The order went to the kitchen. The soup came back beautifully plated. La Fontaine didn't do anything that wasn't Instagram-worthy. Rebecca carried it out with steady hands, weaving through tables with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this thousands of times. But halfway across the dining room, someone's foot, accidentally, deliberately, jutted into the aisle. Rebecca stumbled. The water pitcher in her other hand tilted, and ice water cascaded across Heather's lap like a silver waterfall, soaking through $10,000 of custom satin, staining the midnight blue to something darker. Ruined. The restaurant went silent. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every fork froze midair. 50 pairs of eyes turned to witness the disaster unfolding at table 6. Rebecca stood there, horrified, water pitcher still in her trembling hand, watching the ice cubes slide down expensive fabric and pool on the marble floor. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, She grabbed napkins, desperately trying to blot the damage, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the cloth. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean someone's foot. I can pay for dry cleaning. I can—" Heather sat perfectly still. Her expression was unreadable, not angry, not crying, just distant, like she'd expected this. Like humiliation was something she'd learned to weather with grace because fighting back would cost more than it was worth. "It's fine," she said quietly, her voice carefully controlled. But it wasn't fine. Phones were up now, multiple phones, recording from different angles. The murmur of whispered commentary creating a soundtrack to Rebecca's mortification. Someone giggled. Someone else made a comment about knowing her place. And across the restaurant, near the bar where he'd been standing for the past 30 minutes pretending to check his phone, a man in a deep plum suit watched the entire scene unfold with an expression that would have terrified anyone who knew how to read it. Eric Weber didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching his wife get humiliated in a room full of strangers, watching her dab calmly at her ruined dress, watching her maintain that dignity she wore like armor, even when everything around her was falling apart. His hand tightened around his phone until the screen cracked. Rebecca didn't notice him. She was too busy apologizing, too mortified by the accident, too aware of the eyes on her, the phones recording her failure, the manager already moving toward table 6 with that expression that meant someone was getting fired. "I'll get you a towel," Rebecca stammered. "Fresh napkins. Another dress if we—" "That won't be necessary." Heather's voice was soft but final. She stood slowly, water still dripping from her dress, her pregnant belly obvious now as she rose with careful dignity. "I was leaving anyway." She pulled out her wallet, designer of course, and placed exact change on the table. Then, with trembling fingers that Rebecca noticed but didn't understand, she added 5 crisp $100 bills. $500 for a soup she never ate, for a disaster that ruined her evening. "For your trouble," Heather said quietly, "and your mother's bills. I hope they get better soon." Rebecca froze. How did she? But Heather was already walking toward the exit, moving with that same measured grace despite the wet dress clinging to her legs, despite the whispers following her like shadows, despite the humiliation that should have broken her, but somehow didn't. Rebecca stood there, $500 in her shaking hands, watching the woman disappear through the door, and feeling something she couldn't name twisting in her chest. Guilt, shame, confusion, all of it. Behind her, the manager grabbed her arm. "My office, now." But Rebecca barely heard him. She was watching through the window as Heather approached a black SUV parked illegally right in front of the restaurant. The kind of vehicle that screamed money and power and, "I park wherever I want." A man stepped out of the driver's side, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of presence that made everyone in a room instinctively take a step back. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Rebecca's yearly salary, and his face was the kind you saw in Forbes magazine, in business articles, in headlines about mergers and acquisitions and hostile takeovers. Eric Weber. Rebecca's blood went cold. She watched as Eric's eyes, sharp, dangerous, calculating, took in his wife's condition. The water-stained dress, the trembling hands, the barely contained tears she'd held back for an entire restaurant full of witnesses, but was finally allowing to fall now that she was safe. His jaw clenched. His hand, so gentle as it reached for Heather's arm, contrasted sharply with the absolute fury radiating from every other part of his body. He helped her into the passenger seat with the kind of tenderness that made the rage even more terrifying by comparison. Then he looked back at the restaurant. For just 1 second, Eric Weber's eyes found Rebecca through the window. found her, marked her, memorized her. And Rebecca understood with perfect and absolute clarity that she had just made the worst mistake of her entire life. Eric leaned down to his wife, said something Rebecca couldn't hear, and Heather nodded slowly. Then he closed the car door, walked around to the driver's side, and got in. The SUV drove away, and Rebecca stood there, holding $500 that suddenly felt like blood money, watching her future disappear into Boston traffic. If you want to see how this waitress's life completely unravels when Boston's most powerful billionaire decides to systematically destroy everything she has, subscribe right now. Because what Eric Weber does next isn't loud or obvious, it's surgical, it's calculated, and it will make you question everything you think you know about power, revenge, and grace. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever made a mistake that changed your entire life? That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She lay in her cramped studio apartment, the one with walls so thin she could hear her neighbor's TV through the drywall, and replayed the accident over and over in her mind. The stumble, the water, the ice cubes sliding down expensive satin. The woman's face so carefully controlled even as humiliation washed over her as surely as the water had. And those $500. Why would someone give a waitress who just ruined her dress $500? Why would she mention Rebecca's mother? How did she even know about the medical bills? Rebecca pulled out her phone, typed Eric Weber into Google, and felt her stomach drop with every result that loaded. Self-made billionaire. Weber Industries, real estate, construction, half the Boston skyline. Net worth $4.3 billion, known for ruthless business tactics, hostile takeovers, and a reputation for destroying anyone who crossed him. And she'd just dumped water all over his pregnant wife. Rebecca scrolled through images. There he was at charity galas, at business conferences, at political fundraisers, and beside him in several photos, the woman from Table 6, Heather Sanders Weber, philanthropist, Harvard graduate, Eric Weber's wife of 4 years, the woman Rebecca had humiliated in front of 50 witnesses and multiple recording phones. Rebecca's hands shook as she kept reading. Weber is known for his extreme protectiveness of his family. When a business rival made a disparaging comment about his wife in 2019, Weber quietly bought the man's company, dismantled it, and made sure he never worked in Boston again. Don't cross Eric Weber. He doesn't get mad, he gets even. And his version of even will destroy you so thoroughly you won't even understand what happened until it's too late. Rebecca dropped her phone. It was an accident, a simple, stupid accident. She'd apologized. Heather had said it was fine. Surely that meant her phone buzzed, a text from her manager. Don't come in tomorrow. I'll call you when your schedule is ready. Rebecca stared at the message, dread pooling in her stomach. That wasn't how schedules worked. They were posted 2 weeks in advance. She had shifts lined up through the end of the month. She called him. It went to voicemail. She texted, "Is everything okay?" No response. Rebecca tried to tell herself it was nothing, just coincidence, a scheduling issue. But the article's words echoed in her mind. He doesn't get mad, he gets even. She barely slept. The next morning, Rebecca's phone rang at 6:47 a.m. Her landlord. "Rebecca, I'm sorry to do this, but I've received an offer to sell the building. The new owners are planning renovations, and all current leases will be terminated in 30 days. "What? You can't? I have a lease until—" "It's all legal. Check your contract. The sale clause is in there." He sounded genuinely apologetic. "I'm sorry. I'll return your deposit, of course." The call ended. Rebecca sat on her bed, staring at the wall, trying to process. Her lease was being terminated. Her shifts were cut. And somewhere in her gut, a voice whispered that these weren't coincidences. They were connected. They were deliberate. They were the beginning of something much, much worse. By 9 a.m., she got another call. Her mother's medical clinic, the one that had been managing her oxygen therapy and medications for the past 6 months, was under review by the parent company. Appointments were being rescheduled. New doctors would need to approve continued treatment. "Who's the parent company?" Rebecca asked, her voice hollow. "Weber Healthcare Solutions." Of course it was. Rebecca sat on her apartment floor, surrounded by the life she'd barely been holding together, and watched it start to crumble. Not dramatically, not all at once, just piece by piece, shift by shift, bill by bill. And she knew with absolute terrifying certainty that this was just the beginning. Eric Weber wasn't screaming, wasn't threatening, wasn't even acknowledging her existence. He was simply dismantling her life with the precision of someone who did this professionally. Who had resources she couldn't fight? Who could make her disappear without ever technically breaking a law? Rebecca pulled out her phone, stared at those $500 in cash on her nightstand, and whispered to her empty apartment, "I'm so sorry, but apologies don't reach billionaires." And Eric Weber wasn't listening. He was busy making calls, adjusting investments, moving pieces on a board Rebecca didn't even know she was playing on. She'd embarrassed his wife, and now she would learn, slowly, methodically, systematically, what happened to people who made that mistake. To understand how an accident in Boston's most exclusive restaurant became a billionaire's vendetta, you need to know who these people really were. Not the roles they played that night, waitress, customer, husband watching from the bar, but the humans beneath those labels. Rebecca Smith was 26 years old, a single mother working double shifts just to survive. She lived in a cramped studio where the walls felt closer every night, where her daughter's toys were stacked in corners because there was no proper living room, where medical bills formed towers on her kitchen counter that seemed to grow taller no matter how many shifts she worked. 3 weeks before that Thursday night, Rebecca had been passed over for a promotion that would have changed her life. Assistant manager, with benefits and a salary that might actually cover rent and her mother's oxygen bills. But it went to someone else, someone newer, someone who, Rebecca suspected, was sleeping with the owner. The rejection had been eating at her ever since. Not just the money, though God knows she needed it, but the unfairness of it all. The way she'd worked harder than anyone, smiled through harassment, accepted every extra shift, and still got passed over. She was bitter, exhausted, running on fumes and spite. And that night, when she saw a woman in a $10,000 dress sitting alone in a restaurant where Rebecca would never be able to afford a meal even after a year of tips, something inside her cracked. Not enough to be cruel deliberately, but enough to be careless. Enough to not notice the foot in the aisle. Enough to let the stumble happen instead of catching herself. Enough to feel, for just 1 second before the guilt crashed in, a tiny spark of vindictive satisfaction at seeing someone wealthy experience even a fraction of the humiliation Rebecca lived with every single day. That satisfaction lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then came the horror, the apology, the desperate attempt to fix the unfixable. But the damage was done, and Eric Weber had been watching. Eric and Heather's story was more complicated than anyone in that restaurant knew. They'd been married for 4 years, a love story that started at a charity gala where she was fundraising for education reform, and he was writing checks to feel less guilty about gentrifying entire neighborhoods. She called him out on it, actually, told him to his face that his donations were conscience laundering, and that real change required real work, not just tax-deductible contributions. He'd fallen in love with her on the spot. She'd made him wait 6 months before agreeing to dinner. Their marriage had been passionate, complicated, and recently strained. The pregnancy was supposed to bring them closer. Instead, it highlighted everything that was broken between them. Eric's work consumed him. His need for control extended into every aspect of their life. He made decisions for her instead of with her, always justified with, "I'm protecting you," or "I know what's best." Heather felt suffocated, watched, managed like one of his companies instead of loved like a partner. That Thursday night, she'd gone to LaFontaine alone deliberately, to prove she could, to reclaim some small piece of autonomy, to sit in a public place without Eric's security team shadowing her, without his paranoid need to control her every movement. She'd told him she was going to her sister's house, but Eric knew, of course he knew, he had people tracking her phone, security teams reporting her location. He'd followed her to LaFontaine, watched from across the restaurant, convinced himself he was protecting her while actually violating every boundary she'd asked him to respect. And when that water spilled, Eric saw it as an attack. An assault on his wife, on his unborn child, on everything he'd built walls to protect. He didn't see an accident. He saw a threat, and Eric Weber neutralized threats with extreme prejudice. So when Rebecca's life started falling apart over the next 48 hours, she had no idea she wasn't just fighting a billionaire's revenge. She was caught in the crossfire of a marriage that was cracking under the weight of control, disguised as love, and the woman she'd accidentally humiliated. Heather was watching it all unfold and starting to realize that her husband's version of protection looked an awful lot like cruelty. The collision of these three lives, Rebecca's desperation, Eric's need for control, Heather's fight for autonomy, was about to teach all of them lessons about power that no amount of money could buy. But first, they'd all have to survive Eric Weber's surgical dismantling of a waitress who'd made one mistake on one terrible Thursday night, and the clock was already ticking. The summons came at 8:14 a.m. Rebecca had barely slept, her mind cycling through worst-case scenarios that somehow all felt less terrible than what was actually happening. She was making instant coffee in her cramped kitchenette when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something, instinct, dread, the same force that makes you look at car accidents as you drive past, made her pick up. "Miss Smith?" A woman's voice, professional and cold. "Mr. Weber would like to see you. A car will arrive at your address in 30 minutes. "I what? Who is—" "30 minutes, Miss Smith. Please be ready." The line went dead. Rebecca stood there, phone still pressed to her ear, coffee forgotten. Her hands trembled so badly the phone nearly slipped from her grip. "Mr. Weber would like to see you, not a request, a summons." And the phrasing, "it would like to see you," somehow made it worse. Like she had a choice. Like this was voluntary. 29 minutes later, a black town car pulled up outside her building. The driver didn't speak, didn't smile, just opened the door with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times for 1,000 people who all made the same mistake of crossing Eric Weber. Rebecca got in because she didn't know what else to do. The drive took 17 minutes but felt like hours. Through downtown Boston, past buildings that grew progressively taller and more expensive, until they pulled up to a glass tower that seemed to pierce the sky itself. Weber Industries was carved in steel letters across the entrance. Subtle, powerful, permanent. The elevator ride to the 47th floor was silent except for Rebecca's heartbeat hammering in her ears. The receptionist directed her down a hallway lined with abstract art that probably cost more than Rebecca would earn in her lifetime. Each piece was carefully lit, carefully placed, carefully chosen to communicate one message: this is what power looks like. The office at the end of the hall had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston. The city stretched out below like a toy model, small, manageable, controllable. And behind a desk of black marble and steel sat Eric Weber. He didn't look up when she entered, just kept reviewing something on his tablet, making her stand there, making her wait, making her understand her place in this hierarchy. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, infinitely more terrifying than shouting would have been. "Miss Smith, thank you for coming." As if she'd had a choice, Rebecca's mouth was dry. "Mr. Weber, you embarrassed my wife." He set down the tablet, looked at her for the first time, and Rebecca felt pinned by those eyes. In front of 50 people, with cameras recording, in a moment when she was already vulnerable. "It was an accident." "Was it?" He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "Because from where I stood, it looked like carelessness at best. Negligence. My wife is 7 months pregnant, Miss Smith. That water was ice cold. Do you understand what shock like that could have done? The stress, the potential harm to my unborn child?" Rebecca's stomach twisted. She hadn't thought about that, hadn't considered. "She forgave you," Eric continued, his tone unchanged, still that terrible quiet. "She's generous that way, always has been. It's one of the things I love most about her." He paused. "I haven't decided if I will." The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in civility. "Please," Rebecca whispered. "I swear it was an accident. Someone's foot, I tripped. I would never deliberately. Intent doesn't change outcome. Eric's fingers drummed once against his desk, the only visible sign of emotion. My wife went home in a ruined dress, humiliated, stressed, worrying about our child. Intent doesn't fix that. What do you want me to do? Nothing. He picked up his tablet again, dismissing her with the gesture. This meeting is a courtesy, so you understand why certain adjustments will be made to your circumstances. Consider it a learning experience. Rebecca's blood went cold. What adjustments? But Eric was done talking. He pressed a button on his desk. Security will see you out. The same driver took her home. Rebecca sat in the back seat, mind racing, trying to understand what had just happened. What adjustments meant. Whether she should call a lawyer, a union rep, someone who could. Her phone buzzed. A text from her manager. Schedule change effective immediately. Reduced to 2 shifts per week. Sorry, business needs. 2 shifts, down from 6. That wasn't sustainable. That wouldn't cover rent, wouldn't cover groceries, wouldn't cover another text, this one from her mother's hospital. Insurance review required before continued treatment authorization. Account flagged for verification by parent company. Rebecca's hands shook as she typed. What parent company? The response came 30 seconds later. Weber Healthcare Solutions. She dropped her phone. It wasn't real. This couldn't be real. People didn't actually do this. Systematically dismantle someone's life over an accident, over spilled water, over something that could happen to anyone. But Eric Weber wasn't people. He was power incarnate, and she'd hurt the one thing he actually cared about. Rebecca made it to her apartment before the tears came. She sank onto her floor, back against the door, and understood with perfect clarity that this was just the beginning. 47 floors above the city, Eric Weber stood at his window and felt nothing that resembled guilt. In his mind, this wasn't revenge, it was consequence. It was teaching someone that actions had weight, that carelessness had costs, that you couldn't just apologize your way out of hurting people who mattered. Heather had been crying when she got home, quietly in the bathroom where she thought he couldn't hear. He'd stood outside the door, fists clenched, feeling that familiar rage that came whenever someone made his wife feel small. He'd built an empire to ensure no one could hurt them, to create walls thick enough that the world's cruelty couldn't reach through. And some waitress with shaking hands had breached those walls in an instant. No, not acceptable, not forgivable. Eric pulled out his phone, made 3 calls, and adjusted 3 more pieces on a board Rebecca Smith didn't know she was playing on. Her landlord would receive an offer tomorrow. Her mother's treatment authorization would be delayed, not denied, nothing illegal, just slowed. Her shifts would continue to decrease until La Fontaine quietly let her go for performance issues. It was surgical, methodical, exactly controlled. And if some voice in the back of his mind whispered that this looked less like protection and more like cruelty, well, Eric had spent a lifetime ignoring voices that questioned his decisions. He wasn't about to start listening now. That night, Rebecca sat in her apartment, surrounded by bills she couldn't pay, staring at her phone, and finally understood what that article had meant. He doesn't get mad, he gets even. And his version of even will destroy you so thoroughly you won't even understand what happened until it's too late. She understood now, and she had no idea how to stop it. The night pressed like glass against the bedroom windows, and Heather Sanders lay awake inside it, listening to the city breathe. Somewhere below, a valet laughed. Somewhere above, a plane stitched its way through cloud. Inside the room, the only sound was the tiny, steady clink of memory, crystal, cutlery, the shiver that ran through La Fontaine when water met silk. She could still feel the cold, not from the spill, but from the room that watched it happen. Heather reached for her phone. No new messages. She called Eric anyway. It rang and fell into silence. He never let calls go unanswered. Not hers. Not when she was this far along. That was how she knew. He'd already begun. Eric's vengeance was never loud. It was measured, exacting. The kind that didn't stain the rug but moved the furniture half an inch each day until you kept bumping into edges that weren't there before. The kind you only noticed when you were already bleeding. In a walk-up 2 neighborhoods away, Rebecca folded an eviction notice along its hard crease and set it on the table like a fragile plate she couldn't afford to chip. The landlord's letter used polite words for panic, payment in full, effective immediately. She did the math anyway. It didn't add up unless she skipped her mother's meds. So she called the clinic, heart in her throat, and waited while the receptionist typed. "I'm sorry," the woman said finally, soft like a bruise. "Your mother's subsidy is under review. It's out of our hands." "Under review by who?" A pause, paper sliding, then Weber Health Group. Rebecca thanked her, hung up, and stared at the empty wall until shapes swam. Fate didn't stamp letterhead. People did. People with names. Heather rose with the gray light and found Eric in his office, lit by screens and the sullen glow of a Boston morning. He didn't look surprised to see her. That more than anything hurt. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "I had work." His tone was neutral. There was always work. "On Rebecca Smith?" She held his gaze. "On taking away her shifts, her apartment, her mother's treatment?" He exhaled, slow. "She embarrassed you. She spilled water. You're destroying her life. She humiliated you. She spilled water, Eric. You're drowning her." They stood like that, the city between them, their marriage balanced on a line only they could see. He looked past her, toward the window, toward the buildings, his name held up like a spine. "She could have made you fall," he said, quieter now. "You're 7 months. One shock, one slip, and everything." His voice faltered just for a breath. "I won't risk you." "I know you won't." Heather softened and then didn't. "But this isn't protection. This is punishment." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The screens around him said enough. Reports, memos, the tidy machinery of pressure. She saw the man she'd married, the one who could turn a market with a sentence, and wondered when he'd learn to turn people the same way. "Do you remember why we picked Julian as a name?" she asked. He blinked. "We liked it, and your grandfather." "We said it sounded like light," she whispered. "I'd like him to know his father understands the difference between light and heat." There it was, the flinch, the crack. A tiny mercy she wanted to step through, but fatigue pressed heavy on her bones. She had spent months cushioning the world from Eric and shielding Eric from the world, and the weight of both was beginning to split her in the middle. "Call it off," she said. "All of it. I'll consider it." Consider, as if the girl's rent, the mother's medicine, the hours on some corporate rota were pebbles he could roll in his palm and decide whether to pocket or throw. Heather left before she said something she couldn't soften later. Outside, Boston's air bit clean and cold. She walked without direction because direction meant purpose, and she didn't trust her purpose right now. At a crosswalk, a bus slowed. On the side, a Weber Industries ad, sleek people, gleaming offices, a motto about building futures. She wanted to put her fist through it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Ms. Sanders?" The voice was tentative. "It's Rebecca. I got your contact from someone who said he was a friend of your husband." "Julian, of course." "I'm sorry to call," Rebecca rushed on. My mother's clinic lost funding. My landlord says the company changed. The letter says Weber Holdings." The breath hitched. "If this is because of me, please, tell me what to do to fix it." Heather's eyes stung. "You shouldn't be calling me," she said gently. "I know. I didn't know who else to call." They listened to each other breathe for a moment. "It was an accident," Heather said at last. "I know. It hurt. I know. And this," she swallowed, "this isn't how it should be repaired." Silence. Then Rebecca, "Thank you for saying that." When they hung up, Heather stood very still on the sidewalk until the cold climbed through her coat. Then she dialed Eric again. Voicemail. She typed a message instead. "I spoke to her. I am asking you stop." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. "I'll handle it," he wrote. Handle. Not stop. That night, they ate dinner in the brittle quiet of people who once shared an easy language and now barter in small phrases. He asked how she felt. She said tired. He said he'd be late at the office. She said okay. They both meant we're losing something we may not get back. When he left, Heather went to the nursery. the one painted in warm dawn colors, the one with tiny socks folded like question marks, and sat until the walls felt less close. She thought of her mother's hands, gentle but firm, teaching her that dignity wasn't silence. It was speech without cruelty. She thought of the restaurant's frozen hush, and of every person who watched and filmed and did nothing. She thought of a girl who called because no one else would answer. By midnight, she knew what she had to do. Heather opened her laptop and drafted a statement. Simple, clear, unkind to no one. She didn't name Rebecca. She didn't name Eric. She named a principle. That power must never mistake punishment for protection. She saved it. She didn't post. Not yet. She placed a hand on her belly. The baby rolled, a slow wave under her palm. Light, she whispered. Not heat. In the dark window, her reflection looked like a version of herself she hadn't met yet. Quieter, stronger, less willing to be the woman behind the curtain of someone else's theater. If Eric would not stop, she would, even if it meant stepping into the glare alone. Julian Rogers had seen Eric Weber angry before, the sharp kind of anger that broke competitors but never left fingerprints. But this time, something different gleamed behind his friend's calm eyes. Something colder. Julian had known Eric since college, back when ambition still looked like possibility, not armor. They'd built empires together, Eric the visionary, Julian the voice that kept the empire believable. He'd seen him crush deals, silence rivals, rewrite the rules of entire industries, but never like this. Never over something so small. That morning, Julian stood in the glass office watching Eric scroll through another report, a file marked Rebecca Smith in the corner of the screen. Rent hikes, employment terminations, medical subsidy withdrawals, a neat list of chaos. Is this really necessary? Julian asked quietly. Eric didn't look up. You didn't see her cry. I didn't have to, Julian said. I saw you watching her. That earned a flicker of irritation, quickly buried beneath a smooth mask of control. I thought, this isn't punishment, Eric said. It's protection. She humiliated Heather. She could have fallen. Do you know what that would have meant? Julian studied him. You're not protecting Heather, Eric. You're punishing the world. For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick, electric. Then Eric turned back to the skyline. You wouldn't understand. He was wrong. Julian understood perfectly. That was the problem. He left the office with a strange heaviness in his chest, the city noise below sounding sharper than usual. Back at his apartment, he opened a private folder on his laptop and began saving screenshots. Internal emails, financial adjustments, quiet legal notices, all traceable back to Weber Industries. He didn't know why he was doing it. Instinct, maybe. Insurance. Or maybe he was saving evidence for the day his friend needed saving from himself. Because deep down, Julian knew this story would end in one of two ways: redemption or ruin. Across town, Rebecca sat hunched over her laptop at the tiny kitchen table, a half-empty mug of cold coffee beside her. Her inbox was a graveyard of rejection emails. We regret to inform you that the position has been filled. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. We're no longer considering applicants at this time. Every one of them polite. Every one of them final. She'd applied to 10 restaurants, 6 cafes, 2 hotels, nothing. Not even a callback. When she called to follow up, voices turned careful, mechanical. We appreciate your interest, they said, but she could hear it. The pause, the hesitation. Someone had told them not to hire her. Her fingers trembled as she closed the laptop. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a wall, invisible but solid, and she was being pressed against it harder each day. At her mother's clinic, the nurses whispered when she came in to visit. We're doing what we can, one said softly, but without the subsidy, she might have to be moved. Rebecca nodded, her throat too tight to answer. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed and scrolled through her phone, looking for anything, any glimmer of distraction. And then she saw it, a headline, Billionaire's pregnant wife, Heather Weber, seen leaving LaFontaine, on after emotional dinner. The photo showed Heather in the same blue gown, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, eyes turned away from the flashing cameras. Behind her, just visible in the corner, was the familiar gold trim of the restaurant where Rebecca worked. The caption read, "Witnesses describe her as visibly shaken." Rebecca's heart slammed against her ribs. The woman in the photo, that was her. The same calm voice, the same soft smile after the spill, the same hand clutching her belly as the cold water spread. She whispered the name out loud, Heather Weber. And suddenly the pieces clicked together. The manager's nervousness, the polite rejections, the closed doors, the company names on every letter. The man she'd met in that penthouse office wasn't just angry. He was married to the woman she'd humiliated. Her stomach turned to ice. "Oh God," she murmured, "he's doing this for her." But that didn't make sense. Heather hadn't looked like someone who wanted vengeance. She'd looked tired, hurt, but kind. The kind of woman who would forgive an accident, not ruin a life over it. Rebecca scrolled again, searching for another article, another clue. Nothing, just speculation. The tabloids circling the scent of scandal, but missing the truth entirely. She set the phone down and buried her face in her hands. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't angry. She was ashamed. Not just for the mistake, but for not trying harder to make it right. Somewhere between guilt and desperation, an idea sparked, faint, fragile, but alive. She couldn't reach Eric Weber. He'd already decided what she was worth. But maybe Heather hadn't. Rebecca lifted her head, eyes red but steady now. "If I can just talk to her," she whispered. "If I can make her understand." Her voice broke. The sentence didn't need finishing. It wasn't revenge she wanted anymore. It was redemption. A chance to look that woman in the eye and say the one thing she'd been rehearsing every night in her head, "I'm sorry." She opened her laptop again and began searching. News appearances, public schedules, charity events, anything that might tell her where Heather Weber would be next. Outside, the city pulsed with neon and noise. Somewhere high above, Eric Weber sat in his glass fortress, convinced the world was bending to his will. But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the woman he thought broken was quietly gathering the courage to stand up again. And this time, she wasn't walking into punishment. She was walking toward forgiveness. Rebecca closes her laptop, finds a lead, and whispers to herself, "Tomorrow, I'll find her." The ballroom at the Harbor Exchange glittered like a jewelry box cracked open. Cameras flared, strings sighed. Somewhere between a toast and a pledge, Heather's vision fuzzed at the edges, first like rain on glass, then like night. She reached for a chair that wasn't there. Hands caught her too late. A flute chimed against marble. The crowd inhaled as one. Eric was beside her in 3 strides, voice low and lethal in its calm. "Call an ambulance. Now." He lifted her carefully, the weight of her and the weight of the room settling into his bones at once. Heather's head lolled against his shoulder. His name left her lips like a question. In the hospital's white hush, monitors answered with their own small certainty. The doctor's tone carried no drama, only instruction. Stress, exhaustion. She needs bed rest, no events. No work. Quiet. The city didn't want quiet, it wanted rumors. Marital strain, secret fight, the blue gown and the fall. Eric shut the blinds and silenced his phone, but whispers seeped through like draft under a door. Heather lay very still, watching a line of light crawl up the wall, and thought of a girl with a shaking pitcher and a face that wouldn't leave her alone. She had let the world do the talking. She had let Eric translate hurt into heat. And somewhere in the numbers on the monitors, a conscience kept time. Across town, in a kitchen that smelled like burned toast and worry, Rebecca scrolled and felt her stomach drop clean out of her. Billionaire's wife hospitalized amid pregnancy complications. The photograph was merciless. Heather's hand at her belly, Eric's jaw set like a verdict, a blur of chandelier tears behind them. Guilt hit with a physical force. It wasn't logical, she hadn't caused this, but logic and shame obey different laws. She grabbed the only pen that worked, tore a page from a spiral notebook, and wrote slowly enough not to miss any of the words. "I never meant to hurt you. I've lost everything since that night, but maybe I deserved it. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry." She folded the note, tucked it into her coat, and rode the bus with both hands clenched in her lap. At Mercy Heights, the lobby smelled like lemon and fear. She found the information desk, asked for Heather Weber, felt the pivot in the receptionist's eyes as soon as the name left her mouth. "I'm sorry, this floor is restricted." "I'm not press," Rebecca whispered. "I'm no one. I have to give her something." The guard's hand hovered politely near his belt. "Ma'am," the elevator chimed. Fate stepped out carrying a coffee. Julian Rogers froze halfway to his phone. Recognition clicked into place slowly, like a safe tumbling toward the right combination. He had watched Rebecca's life get folded and put away in neat corporate drawers. He had the screenshots to prove it. Now she stood in front of him with a paper scrap and a face you couldn't fake. "Ms. Smith," he said, uncertainty rounding the edges of her name. She nodded, eyes wet but steady. "I'm not here to make a scene. I need her to know I'm sorry." Julian's job was to keep fires from starting. Letting her in was the opposite of his job. He stared at the coffee until his reflection settled, then made the worst decision he'd make for all the right reasons. "Come with me," he said. On the maternity floor, light softened. Even footsteps learned to whisper. He waited outside while Rebecca entered the room where the monitor blinked their calm metronome and Heather slept with one hand splayed over the slope of her belly. Rebecca moved like someone in a church. She set the note on the tray table, smoothed it twice, and stood there a beat longer than she meant to, as if presence itself could carry apology farther than paper ever could. Then she left the way she'd come, small and silent and terribly human. Julian watched her disappear into the elevator and thought about the file on his laptop labeled Rebecca Smith, and the one he'd started that morning labeled Evidence. He thought about Eric saying, "You didn't see her cry," and how much smaller a sentence is than a woman with a note. Heather woke to the sound of soft wheels and softer voices. She blinked the room into focus, saw the folded square by the water cup, and knew what it was before she touched it. The handwriting was careful in places, crooked in others, the way grief is. By the last line, tears had gathered without asking permission. Not the hot kind that demanded a witness, the quiet kind that arrived when a burden finally admits its name. Peace isn't dramatic. It doesn't crash in. It sits at the edge of a bed and places a hand on yours and says, "Now we can begin." When Eric returned, he found her awake and strange with some new softness. He took her hand like a vow. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been holding my breath," she said, "and I finally remembered how." He frowned, a man who preferred problems he could buy an answer for. "No more events, no interviews. I've increased security." "Eric," her voice was gentle. It had always been gentlest when it held the hardest things. She slid the note into his palm. He read, jaw unclenching by degrees he didn't notice. "Julian let her in," he said too quickly. "I'm glad someone did." He looked at his wife as if trying to remeasure a room he thought he knew. "She humiliated you. She spilled water. She set off the press." "We did that," Heather said softly. "We're the ones with the microphones." She drew a breath that found its way all the way down. "I can live with humiliation. I can't live with cruelty done in my name." He stared at the window, at the narrow wedge of river you could see if you tilted your head just so. The silence went long enough to become an answer. Heather spared him the gracelessness of making her say it twice. "If you keep hurting her," she said, calm as the monitor's green line, "you lose me." The words didn't rise. They settled. They found the floor beneath power and stood there, unafraid. Eric didn't move. The room didn't either. Only the small, steady music of the machines continued, measuring a future that, for the first time in weeks, felt like it could be different. The city glowed below like a constellation trapped in glass. From the penthouse balcony, Eric Weber watched it flicker, every light a reminder of something he could command, and something he could not fix. The wind was sharp against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind replayed Heather's words again and again, each one cutting deeper than the last. "If you keep hurting her, you lose me." He had spent his whole life building empires, networks, towers, reputations, and yet those 7 words had undone him more efficiently than any rival could. They hadn't come from anger. They had come from truth. Eric exhaled slowly, gripping the railing until the metal bit into his palms. He wasn't the kind of man who begged for forgiveness. He was the kind who made problems disappear. But this wasn't business. This was rot, spreading from the inside. Inside, Heather slept lightly. The machines in the corner blinked their silent rhythm. Every rise and fall of her breathing reminded him that all his wealth meant nothing if he lost her. By dawn, he had made his decision. He called his legal advisor first. "End the review at Mercy Heights," he said, voice even. "Yes, sir. Which department?" "All of it. Every account affected." Next came the call to LaFontaine. "Reinstate Rebecca Smith," he ordered the manager. "Full hours, no questions." A beat of hesitation. "Mr. Weber, she might not want—" "She'll take it." Before the sun had cleared the skyline, he'd wired a payment to the hospital under an anonymous account. The outstanding balance of a woman named Linda Smith, marked paid in full. He stared at the confirmation email for a long time after it arrived, expecting relief. None came. Mercy, he realized, was quieter than vengeance. It didn't roar. It didn't break glass. It just sat there, heavy, incomplete. Because you can't undo cruelty by cleaning its traces. You can only live with the echo. When he finally came home, Heather was awake. Pale morning light softened her face. Her hair spilled across the pillow like a memory he'd been afraid to touch. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, unsure if he still had the right. "I called everything off," he said finally. Her eyes lifted, slow and uncertain. "Everything?" "Rebecca, her job, her mother's care. It's done." Heather watched him for a long time before answering. "Thank you." Her voice was quiet, almost too kind. That was somehow worse. He crossed to the bed, sat on the edge, and took her hand. Her fingers felt smaller than he remembered. Or maybe his guilt had grown too large to hold them properly. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I know," she whispered. "But protection, without compassion, becomes control." He looked down, shame pooling in his chest. "You shouldn't have had to ask me to stop." Heather's thumb brushed against his knuckles, steadying him. "Forgiveness," she said, "isn't weakness. It's strength that chooses peace instead of pride." The words lodged deep. He'd spent years teaching himself that mercy was a liability, that the world only respected power. But Heather had always been the exception, the one person who could make him doubt his own definition of strength. Silence stretched between them, soft but full. Then, beneath her hand, a small movement, the unmistakable flutter of life. The baby kicked. Eric froze. The sound he made wasn't quite laughter, but it wasn't grief either. Something inside him cracked open, not from pain, but from release. For the first time in months, he felt something that wasn't anger or control. It was surrender. He pressed his forehead to Heather's hand, eyes closing. "I don't deserve you." Heather smiled faintly. "Maybe not. But our child deserves a father who remembers what love looks like." He stayed there for a long time, listening to the rhythm of two heartbeats, one steady, one fluttering, both stronger than his own resolve. That night, Heather slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Eric stood by the window, watching the city again, not as a man surveying his empire, but as someone who'd finally seen how fragile it all was. Then his phone buzzed, a single notification. At first he ignored it, but the preview line stopped him cold. Viral post, the night LaFontaine froze. Billionaire's wife and the waitress who shook Boston. He opened it. There it was, the photo. Heather in her blue gown, water spilling across the tablecloth like glass in motion. Rebecca standing rigid beside her, horror on her face. And in the corner, blurry but unmistakable, him, the caption burned. Leaked image from the infamous restaurant incident resurfaces. Insiders hint at corporate retaliation. Eric's pulse quickened. The article was spreading fast. Thousands of shares, speculation swirling like wildfire. The world was waking up to the story he had tried to bury. And this time, it wouldn't be Rebecca's life on trial. It would be his. He turned toward the bedroom where Heather slept unaware, the faint light of her monitor tracing the curve of her face. He whispered to no one, "I fixed it too late." Outside, the city lights pulsed brighter, as if mocking him. 1,000 points of power he could control, and one truth he couldn't. Once the world sees behind the curtain, there's no pulling it closed again. By morning, the photo had a life of its own. It sat on every timeline like an accusation. Heather in midnight blue, water shattering across linen, Rebecca frozen mid-breath, and in the corner, Eric, blurred but unmistakable. Headlines did what headlines do. Humiliation at La Fontaine, power plays in silk and steel. Who is the mystery waitress? Eric's PR war room lit up like a runway. Phones chirped, screens refreshed. Someone drafted a statement. Someone else drafted the apology to follow it. A junior staffer suggested pinning the narrative on a miscommunication. Another floated the word incident, soft enough to step around. Julian stood at the end of the table, hands in his pockets, watching panic multiply. "No euphemisms," he said, finally. "No targeted leaks, no character smears." A VP blinked. "Then what do we say?" "The truth," Julian answered, and the room went very still, as if he'd suggested arson. He looked at Eric. "Stop pretending this was a tidy misunderstanding. A woman was humiliated in public. Another woman made a mistake and then paid for it in private. That's the story." Eric's jaw flexed. "And whose fault is that, Julian?" Julian held his gaze. "Yours and mine. And the machine we built that can crush people by not noticing them." He turned to the team. "Draft a statement that admits corporate overreach and commits to process changes. No spinning the waitress. No whispers about her attitude or history. We don't do that." "We'll get slaughtered," someone muttered. "Then we get slaughtered honestly," Julian said. Across the river, La Fontaine's kitchen turned into a whisper mill. Cooks traded theories between orders. Hosts swapped half-facts at the stand. By lunch, Rebecca's name had crawled up from rumor to target. "So that's you?" a server said, tapping the photo on her phone by the phone. "Famous." Another tried for pity and landed on condescension. "You okay? You look tired." In the walk-in, Rebecca pressed her forehead to the cool steel and tried to breathe through the ache. "Pity pried at your seams." Mockery cut straight through. "Both in their own now sent you toward the door." She almost quit. Twice. The first time, she wrote the text to her manager and deleted it. The second time, she took her apron off and then put it back on because her mother still needed medicine, and medicine still needed money. That night, as she locked the back door, her phone rang from an unfamiliar number. "Rebecca?" The voice was soft and grain-warm. "It's Heather." For a second, the alley lost gravity. Rebecca leaned against the brick. "Mrs. Weber, Heather is fine," came the gentle correction. "Would you meet me for coffee? Somewhere quiet." They chose a small cafe with a window that caught the late afternoon like honey in a jar. Heather arrived in a simple sweater and no makeup, hair pulled back in a way that looked like peace. She sat with care, one hand drifting to her belly in an unconscious blessing. Rebecca didn't know where to put her own hands. On the table felt presumptuous. In her lap felt like hiding. She settled for folded, knuckles white. "I'm sorry," she blurted, before the coffee even landed. "You had every right to hate me." "That," Heather said softly, "is what made it so wrong." Rebecca looked up, startled. Heather's eyes held no triumph, no glossed-over benevolence, only a tired kind of clarity. "I watched the photo spread," Heather continued, "and I realized I'd been letting silence translate for me. Silence speaks fluent cruelty when power holds the microphone." Rebecca's mouth trembled. "I spilled water, and then a man rewrote my life." "I let him," Heather said. She didn't make it smaller than it was. "I told myself it wasn't my choice." "It was. I'm sorry." The coffee steamed between them, and cooled by degrees neither noticed. They talked like people who had almost missed each other in a crowded room and were startled to discover they'd been saying the same sentences at opposite ends. Rebecca told her about the calls that went unanswered, the way doors shut gently, efficiently. Heather told her about the hospital quiet, about the line of light on the wall, about realizing that keeping kind thoughts to yourself is another form of harm. I don't know how to make it right, Rebecca said, voice small. Neither do I, Heather admitted, but I know how to begin. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then moved with a decision that felt like a bell being rung in a high ceiling. She typed slowly, no PR gloss, no clever phrasing, just clean lines. I was humiliated in public. A woman made a mistake under pressure. What happened to her afterward happened in my name. That's not protection. That's punishment. Today I'm choosing grace. I forgive Rebecca Smith. She paused, looked up. May I tag you? Rebecca's breath hitched. The internet could be a flood, or it could be a furnace. It did not do half measures, but hiding had already burned her. She nodded. Okay, she whispered. Tag me. Heather added the name, hit post, and set the phone down like you set down a lit match, carefully ready for whatever catches fire. The first comments rolled in as expected. Praise, fury, cynicism, relief, queen energy, too little, too late, money forgives money, humility looks good on power. Then the second wave, servers sharing their own stories from dining rooms that taught the wrong lessons. Nurses talking about subsidies under review. A hostess wrote about how a regular stopped saying her name when she dyed her hair and how small she felt and how long it took to feel like a person again. It was messy. It was loud. It was the internet. But under the noise, something else started to thread through. Longer comments, quieter ones, people trying to untangle the knot instead of tightening it. Forgiveness moving in like water where outrage had been a wall. Back in the war room, the PR team watched the Post detonate every script they'd drafted. The VP who'd wanted euphemisms swore softly. What do we do now? Julian exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. We follow her lead, he said. We tell the truth. Eric read the Post twice, then a third time, the line in my name catching like a hook. He looked out at the city and felt the strange sensation of a fortress letting in air. At La Fontaine, someone at the service station turned their phone toward Rebecca. You're tagged, they said, equal parts awe and warning. She opened the Post, read it once, then again. The restaurant noise blurred. In her chest, something unclenched that she'd been squeezing for weeks without noticing. The internet split itself into camps as it does, but in 100 small corners, the kind without blue check marks or shouting, people began to talk about grace like it was a skill you could practice. And for the first time since the pitcher slipped, Rebecca felt the ground shift towards something that might hold. As the comments climb, a new notification lands. An invitation with Heather's name at the top and a meeting time beneath. Tomorrow, let's do this right. 3 days after Heather's post, Rebecca's phone wouldn't stop ringing. At first, it was small local outlets, Boston Daily, Channel 4 Morning News. Then came the national calls. We'd like to hear your side, they said. How does it feel to be forgiven by a billionaire's wife? Rebecca almost laughed the first time she heard the question. Forgiven. She hadn't been chasing forgiveness. She'd been chasing the ability to look at herself in the mirror without flinching. Still, she agreed to one interview, then another. Each one, she reminded herself, wasn't about her at all. It was about what Heather had done, what grace looked like in action. The first time she sat beneath the studio lights, her palms slick against her knees, the host smiled kindly. You've become something of an internet symbol for humility, the host began. What do you want people to take from your story? Rebecca swallowed. That it doesn't take wealth to do the right thing, she said softly. It just takes the courage to stop defending your worst moment and start growing from it. The producer's eyes flicked up from behind the glass wall, surprised. She continued, people think forgiveness is weakness. It's not. It's a mirror. It shows you who you really are. And sometimes you don't like what you see, but that's how change starts. The clip aired that night. By morning, it had over 6 million views. At the Weber's penthouse, the glow of the television spilled across the nursery. Heather sat on the couch, cradling their newborn son, Julian, his small breaths barely stirring the blanket. Eric stood beside her, watching Rebecca's face on the screen. She speaks well, he murmured. She speaks honestly, Heather replied. Her tone carried no judgment, only calm. That's rarer. Eric watched the feed cut to commercial, the silence that followed thick with unspoken irony. He could buy networks, build skyscrapers, fund entire hospitals. And yet, it was this woman, a waitress he'd nearly destroyed, who had humanized his name again. Heather looked down at Julian, smiling faintly. Funny, isn't it? A simple apology did what your PR team couldn't. Eric didn't answer right away. The words settled deep, in a place success had never reached. He turned toward the window, where the city shimmered below like glass dust. Julian, he said suddenly. Heather looked up. Hmm? He smiled faintly. Not the baby, the man, my friend. Julian Rogers answered the knock on his apartment door, expecting an argument. Instead, Eric stood there, awkwardly holding a bottle of scotch that probably cost more than the rent. You bringing peace offerings now? Julian asked, stepping aside. Something like that. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. Eric poured 2 glasses, the ice clinking like punctuation. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eric sighed. You were right, he said finally. I was fighting ghosts. Julian raised a brow. Took you long enough to notice. I thought power meant control, Eric continued. If I could fix everything, I could keep what I loved safe. But all I did was break things in the name of protection. Julian swirled his drink. And now? Eric looked at his reflection in the amber. Now I'm learning that maybe the hardest thing a man can do is let something heal on its own. Julian smiled slightly, tapping his glass against Eric's. Welcome to humanity, old friend. They drank in silence, 2 men finally unarmed. Back home, Heather rocked baby Julian in the nursery chair. Eric stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, the soft exhaustion of new fatherhood etched into his face. The city buzzed below, but in that small room, time moved slower. He knelt beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. You were right, he said quietly, about forgiveness, about everything. Heather smiled, tired but luminous. You don't need to say it, just keep living like you mean it. Their son stirred in his sleep, a tiny sigh escaping his lips. Heather looked down at him with a tenderness that seemed to refill the air itself. Let's build something real now, Eric. Not just a company or an empire. A life. He nodded. For the first time in years, the word build didn't sound like ambition. It sounded like home. The next few months passed like a slow sunrise. Rebecca continued her quiet campaign of honesty, speaking at community centers, restaurants, and universities. Her words weren't rehearsed. They didn't need to be. People listened because she didn't sound perfect. She sounded true. Heather recovered, motherhood softening the edges of her once guarded world. And Eric learned stillness, the kind that doesn't need applause to exist. Every so often, the 3 of them would cross paths in headlines. Rebecca quoted about grace, Heather about resilience, Eric about reform. Each mention felt like a page turning, the story rewriting itself with gentler ink. Then, one quiet morning, Heather stood at the penthouse window with Julian in her arm. The sun painted the skyline gold. I want to go back, she said. Eric looked up from his laptop. Back? To La Fontaine. He blinked. Why? Heather's smile was small, sure, because that's where it ended and where it should begin again. He hesitated. People will talk. Let them, she said softly. This time they'll be talking about peace. She turned back toward the window, the city gleaming before her like a second chance waiting to be taken. And somewhere across town, Rebecca wiped down a polished table, unaware that soon their paths would meet once more. This time, not as enemies or victims, but as 2 women who had learned that grace, once shared, doesn't fade. It multiplies. 3 months later, Heather makes the reservation herself. Table 6. The same table where it all began. La Fontaine looked exactly the way memory said it would. Golden chandeliers floating like captured suns, crystal catching light, the soft percussion of cutlery and conversation. But there was one difference, quiet and enormous. No whispers followed the woman in midnight blue. Heather paused just inside the entrance, their son drowsing against her shoulder, his small breaths warm on her collarbone. Eric's palm rested at the small of her back. Not directing, not claiming, just there, present. At the host stand, a familiar voice. Welcome to La Fontaine. Rebecca turned and almost dropped the leather book in her hands. For a fraction of a second, the past rushed in. The spill, the gepel, the freeze. Then reality returned, steadier, kinder. The gold of the room seemed to lift her. Heather, she said softly, and then with the practice she'd earned and not faked, Mr. Weber. Her new name tag, Rebecca Smith Manager, caught the light. Good evening, Rebecca greeted, voice trembling on the first syllable and braver on the second. Heather smiled, warmth rising like color to her face. It's good to see you again. Rebecca's eyes flicked to the baby, then back. You're really okay? Heather glanced at her child, the tiny fist peeking from the blanket, the slow, dreaming stretch. More than okay. Eric extended a hand across a history that used to be a chasm. Thank you, he said. Nothing grand, nothing polished. For reminding me what grace looks like. Rebecca took his hand. It was not a gesture for an audience. It was a bridge laid plank by plank. Thank you for listening when it mattered, she said. No one flinched at the word mattered. It belonged here now. Rebecca led them to table 6, the same corner, the same chandelier. This time, no cameras cocked like weapons. A soft murmur of welcome passed from staff to staff. Someone at the service station smiled too brightly. A line cook craned for a glimpse and returned to his pans with a grin. Menu settled. Water poured without irony. Eric asked for still, Heather for sparkling. The baby sighed and returned to dreaming. They talked the way people do when the worst thing is behind them and the best thing refuses to be rushed. Lightly, then deeply, then lightly again. Rebecca checked in without hovering. The servers moved with that ballet of competence that looks like magic until you try to do it yourself. The kitchen sent out a small, beautiful mistake, an amuse-bouche that wasn't on the menu, apology, and blessing on a porcelain spoon. They ate it laughing because there are some kinds of symmetry you don't fear anymore. At a corner table, half hidden by a palm, a man in a green hoodie lifted his phone. Not the skulking tilt of scandal, but the careful frame of witness. He filmed a few quiet seconds. The passing of bread, the tip of a wine glass, a baby's yawn. He put the phone down and kept eating. Later, he would post it with a caption that said, almost nothing. Same table, different ending. The internet, for once, would follow his lead. Between courses, Heather excused herself to the quiet alcove near the restrooms, where wall sconces poured honeyed light down white plaster. Rebecca followed with a linen over her arm, manager's habit about to offer practical help, and then pausing because this wasn't about logistics anymore. I never said thank you, Heather began. You did, Rebecca said, just not with words. They smiled at the same time, the easy kind that doesn't test the room for permission. I'm learning, Rebecca added, that apology is a thing you keep doing, not once but across a life. Heather nodded. And forgiveness, she said, is a muscle you build. She looked down at her sleeping son. I want him to see both. Rebecca's eyes shone. He will. She hesitated, then, I kept the note, the one you returned to me after the hospital. It reminded me that being sorry means changing on purpose. Heather touched Rebecca's arm, gentle. It shows. Back at the table, the entree arrived, fragrant and beautiful. Eric carved and shared and wiped a tiny bloom of sauce from Heather's wrist, like it was the first time he'd ever touched her. In some ways it was. They didn't perform for the room. They simply were. When the bill came, tastefully folded, plain as always, Rebecca placed it down with a small card. It wasn't a discount. It wasn't publicity. It was a donation receipt in the restaurant's name. Quietly redirecting a portion of tonight's take to Mercy Heights' patient fund. Heather's breath caught. Who authorized this? Eric asked, though he already knew. Rebecca shrugged. We've had a good quarter. Eric glanced toward the kitchen, where the chef pretended to care about a particularly uncooperative sprig of thyme. We'll match it, he said quietly. Quiet is our specialty, Rebecca replied, and they laughed. Not at anyone, but with the relief of people who had learned to use their voices the right way. They stood to leave. The room did not hush. It didn't need to. Dinners continued. Someone proposed at the bar. A busboy dropped a spoon, and two servers clapped for the sheer joy of solidarity. Normalcy, hard-won, hummed. At the door, the man in the green hoodie caught Heather's eye and lifted his hand in a small salute, the kind neighbors exchange across driveways. She returned it. Later, when his short video, the one with no commentary and no bait, rolled through a million feeds, it would feel like proof of something people secretly hope about themselves. That we can be better in public the second time. On the sidewalk, the night had that Boston brightness, post-rain and clear, the kind of air that always makes the city feel younger. Eric hailed a car but didn't rush. He looked at Heather like the skyline was a backdrop for her, not the other way around. She watched the restaurant's windows glow and thought of everything that had happened within their frame. Humiliation, harm, apology, beginnings. The baby stirred, tiny fingers unfurling as if to hold the lights. In her head, the words arranged themselves, clean and true. A benediction meant less for the world than for the three of them moving through it. Power can build towers, she thought, watching their reflections in the glass, tall and small and human. But only grace can rebuild hearts. And sometimes the richest souls are those humbled by love.